uh, it has some deep ties with Berkeley. So the kind of grandfather of the field is Peter Marler. Peter Marler was a professor at Berkeley. It says here from 1957 to 1966. I was born somewhere in between those two extremes there. And Peter Marler was, he's kind of a prominent figure in animal communication. So he did a lot of things, not just in birds, but also in primate communication. And the first paper that he did in birds, this is when he was a postdoc in England, was published here in IBIS in 1956. And I think the title is kind of interesting. It says, "The Voice of the Chaffinch and Its Function as a Language." Okay, so here's already, the very first kind of paper, a link between, animal calls or animal communication, in particular bird communication here, and language. And this paper was not about vocal learning or vocal plasticity. It was just about the fact that the chaffinch was using all these different calls to that had different meanings to communicate. So it was really about the repertoire. When he came to Berkeley, to move you guys away here, you're in the way of my presentation. When he came to Berkeley, he became interested in the fact that some of these the vocal calls that are producing were plastic. And you can see here again, the title of the paper that he published in 1962 in Condor, where he says, "Song dialects in 3 populations of white-crowned sparrows." And notice that he put dialects into quotes, but the use of dialect is also interesting, I think, from a linguistic perspective, right? It's again relating this to language and to human dialects. This is the kind of cool little historical note here. If you read the paper, you see that he's comparing the song of the white-crowned sparrows in 2 different regions of the Bay Area: Santa Cruz, the central part of the city of Berkeley, and then the area on Inspiration Point. So we don't have white-crowns in Inspiration Point anymore. I think it just got too dry there, but there's still plenty of white-crowns in Berkeley, especially towards the Bay. There's definitely white-crowns in Santa Cruz, a lot of white-crowns in Point Reyes. And if you go and if you listen to them, if you listen to them carefully, you'll see that within each one of these areas, they will have a slightly different song, right? And so the idea is, well, look, they've kind of like copied each other to have this dialect that they can understand, within their group. So let me just play you a white-crown song. So that's a typical kind of white-crown song. I'm sure you've heard some of these. There's a first portion where there's these whistles, and then there's these trills. These are spectrograms where you have time on the x-axis and you have frequency on the y-axis. It's a nice visual of a sound that gives you a lot of information. What Peter Marler did after doing his dialect was trying to be more scientific about it and to really show that this was something that was a learned behavior, not just something about the genetics of, local genetics of the birds. And so there were experiments done to isolate white-crowns and experiments done to deafen white-crowns that were performed at the Berkeley Field Station, where Steve Glickman was also doing his work. And so, so here what you'll hear is another song of a white-crown that is normally raised, and it sounds like this. And then if you take a white-crown and you isolate them, so once they're a chick, you isolate them from the parents, it's going to produce a very abnormal song that sounds like this. Okay, and so clearly they needed to have social interaction and maybe tutoring, right, to learn this. And so Peter Marler went on to do more experiments and showed that the way that the white-crowns do this is that the first year when they're born, they're just listening for models. They're listening for something to copy. So this is called a tutor song, or they're listening for, right, just from their father, and they're making a memory of a thing to copy. And they don't start to practice until the following breeding season, until the following year, where they actually then start to rehearse, and they will learn to copy what they've learned first. And so this is pretty amazing to be able to do this. Right, this ability to kind of do this, what's called vocal learning, you'll see that I'm going to use another term very soon, is very unique among animals. There's very few animals that are able to do this, and birds are incredible with this. And so I want to show you this video from the BBC, from David Attenborough, that shows the abilities of the amazing lyrebird. I don't know how many of you have seen this.
The superb lyrebird of South Australia. He clears a space in the forest to serve as his concert platform. To persuade females to come close and admire his plumes, he sings the most complex song he can manage, and he does that by copying the songs of all the other birds he hears around him, such as the kookaburra. It's a very convincing impersonation. Even the original is fooled. He can imitate the calls of at least 20 different species. He also, in his attempt to outsing his rivals, incorporates other sounds that he hears in the forest. That was a camera shutter. And again. And now a camera with a motor drive. And that's a car alarm. And now the sounds of foresters and their chainsaws working nearby.
Okay, so I hope you are very impressed by this. It's at the same time, I think, incredibly amazing, right? And it is the same thing that actually the white crown is doing when it's copying the song of a tutor. Same thing that my little zebra finches are doing, but taking to kind of the extreme of this vocal imitation. I think at the same time, this hadn't struck me until not that long ago. It's not the same thing that we humans do. We are able to imitate, right? We're able to imitate an accent. We are able to, imitate the voice of somebody else. But when we learn language, we're not necessarily imitating the sounds of our parents, right? Otherwise, we'd be going, baby, right? And young babies don't do that, right? They just learn to make these phonemes that have these meanings. So there's obviously this ability that is required for humans to be able to produce language or produce speech, but there's something that's also kind of fundamentally different. And then the other thing that you will obviously realize is that this imitation serves not a communication purpose, because the song always means the same thing in some ways for the birds, right? It's in this case of the lyrebird, it's a display to attract the females. So the message is always the same, is like, look, I'm beautiful and I can produce these complex sounds. Whereas in humans, there's really learning about categories of sounds that have specific meanings. So an amazing ability, something that is essential for human language, but with some, I think, very important differences. Sorry about the slide you've been staring at a little bit. This is what I was explaining before, that the song learning behavior is actually divided into the sensory phase, where the birds are just listening without actually producing song, and a sensory motor learning phase in which during which they're actually rehearsing to produce the song. And in most species, these two are separate. And what's amazing about this, right, is that if they have a normal sensory acquisition, so if they're able to memorize the tutor song during this period, they don't have to have a tutor during this period. So they can learn from memory. So they're able to kind of learn their song from memory. So they have to have some kind of internal representation of this template that they're going to produce. Okay, so that's the birth of the field. Let me tell you a little bit about the neurobiology that came. So Peter Myler had two students were here at Berkeley, Fernando Nottebohm and Mark Konishi, two grad students of Peter Myler. And Fernando Nottebohm is the discoverer of what's called the song system. And so these are these brain areas that are found in songbirds that are specialized for the production of song and for learning to produce the song. So very, very much involved into the production. He discovered them simply by comparing the brains of male canaries and female canaries. And the song learning and the song production is sexually dimorphic, and so it's present in males and not in females. This is not true for all birds, but in canaries, it's almost the case. And so he found all these areas that were present in males and not in females in the brain. And by the way, this was the first example of sexual dimorphism in a vertebrate brain, and it is till now the kind of the most striking striking proof that there could be major differences in the brains of males and females in vertebrates. Mark Konishi was more involved in the mechanism, so he is the first person who did the deafening in the birds and showed that if you deafen a bird, they will not sing normally. And he was also the first person to stick electrodes, like is shown here, into the song areas. So the area shown in purples, and the names don't matter too much, are these nuclei that are just involved in song production. As Jack mentioned, I was at that time, or when I started working on songbirds, I went to UCSF and I was a postdoc for Alison Dope, who is shown here. So this is on a ski trip. And I got interested in neurons that were first recorded in the lab of Mark Konishi by Dan Margolies, that showed this incredible selectivity. So this is a little bit like the grandmother cell of auditory neurons. And so I'll show you an example of these. So if you look at the top panels here, I have to move you guys again. What you see is the presentation of three different sounds. So this is here, the BOS stands for the bird's own song. So this is the bird's own song on the left panel. This is if you take that song and play it in reverse. And this is if you take a song from a conspecific, so from another zebra finch, and you play it back and you record, and every single line of this is a trial. And you get these rasters every time you have an action potential, and then you get your average response that's shown here in a histogram. And you can see that these neurons respond very strongly to the bird's own song, and then don't have any responses to these other stimuli. Simultaneously, I was recording in the auditory areas. By the way, this is one of the first EFIS recordings I did here at UC Berkeley. So this must have been 1999, my first recording at Cal. And what you can see is that in the auditory areas, you get responses to all these sounds. So extremely selective neurons. In one of the studies I did, I just started to perturb the song just slightly, either temporally or spectrally, and you can immediately see degradations in this kind of response. Okay, so this was kind of very interesting, and people thought, aha, this might be, or looks like a good candidate for the memory of the birdsong song, because or of the tutor song more precisely, because look, you have this kind of strong response to the in this case to the birdsong song, and these there's no responses to all these other sounds. The problem with that is that these neurons emerge not during the sensory period, well, the bird is memorizing the song, but during the sensory motor period. So these neurons really emerge when the bird is starting to produce. So they cannot be the memory of the tutor song, right? Now that we know more about it, they're really keeping track of the motor program. And if you drive the motor program with the stimulus that it's producing, you get these neurons to fire, to drive like that. Okay, so no. Okay, so that's a little bit the beginning of the neurobiology, and this is kind of where the path splits a little bit between the what is more classically known as the birdsong field and kind of what I did in the first 10, 15 years at Cal. So people took this and sold it to NIH as a model system to study vocal learning, and this unique model system because this ability is present in birds and not in any or very few other animals. The field was very successful. Was well funded for a long time. I think now it's a lot more difficult, and found a lot of really cool things. I think the one for me that's the most significant is the motor code, the neural code for vocal sequences. So for this kind of sequences, stereotype sequence of vocal gestures, right? This complex kind of motor acts. How are you going to represent that in a hierarchical fashion? And the bird work for that is just excellent. And any of you are interested in motor programs, you should look at some of the papers for that, because I think it's very impressive. And then there's other things, the role of motor variability during learning, the fact that you want to explore space. There's a lot of work on reinforcement learning and dopamine, neurogenesis, the role of the birth of new neurons for this kind of plastic motor behaviors. There's hormones and behavior and so forth. So a list of things that were discovered by studying songbirds as a model system. I was kind of not doing any of this. I became more interested in what's happening in the auditory system. And the reason for this is partly the failure of these neurons that were found in the song nuclei to be a memory. So I figure, the memory must be in the auditory system. Let's go and explore the auditory system. And when I started this, I realized, first of all, we didn't really know what was happening in auditory cortical areas, and even less so in the avian auditory system. So I spent a lot of time kind of describing the auditory system. This is where we developed methods, and Jack's lab participated with this. So it's kind of a collaboration to kind of extract, in my case, spectral temporal receptive fields from natural sounds. The big lesson here, if I want to summarize it, is that if you think about the auditory system at the periphery, it works like a frequency filter bank. It decomposes the sounds into channels that have different frequencies. And as you move up the auditory processing stream, it works as a modulation filter bank. And a modulation filter bank is telling you that beyond just frequency, you're looking for structure and time. So things that would give you things like rhythm, as well as structure in the frequency space that would give you percepts like timbre. And so we're able to kind of map, this is the recording from the auditory cortex of the bird, kind of what this modulation filter bank looks like. People have done the same thing with cortex. So this is a slide from Eddie Chang's lab at UCSF, but Bob Knight and I did some spectral temporal receptive fields here as well. So this is this work that happened at Berkeley as well. So so this has led to kind of, you know, a lot of the work that I've done that I'm not going to be talking about. Okay, so we started with talking about communication, right, and the interest, the link between bird song and human language, and the fact that this vocal plasticity or vocal learning is so unique. And then I mentioned, as I show you the video of the lyrebird, that yes and no, right? That in some ways, yes, this ability of imitation is important, but it's also very different than what humans do. And also, we haven't really talked about communication at all. We haven't talked about a message going from a, you know, sender and receiver, and how that works. And Peter Marler, who in some ways both you know, at the very beginning of his career was very interested in kind of animal communication and the repertoire, you know, started this whole field that, you know, went off into its own direction by really focusing on this, you know, motor plasticity behavior. And I think he was a little disappointed, is maybe a strong word, but he kind of, you know, called, you know, pull the alarm at some point. So this is, you know, we had a meeting in 2004 of the whole birdsong community. And that year he wrote 2 papers that I think are kind of interesting, that were supposed to be wake-up calls. And, you know, one of them was more for ethologists, and one was more for neurobiologists or neuroethologists. And if you read the introduction to one of these papers, you can see that he's in his very British ways, he you know, he goes and says how wonderful the song is, but that we're, you know, missing the boat because we have been ignoring all the other calls that songbirds are producing. Kind of in parallel, Julie Elie, who is a French PhD, was working in Australia and recording from the zebra finches in the wild, and realized that if you record from these birds in the wild, song is one of the calls that is the least produced, but they produce all these other calls all the time. Because they're, you know, exchanging important information about dangers, about, you know, where they are with respect to each other, and so forth. And so I was lucky enough that Julie joined the lab in 2010 and was a postdoc in my lab for 6 years, and kind of changed the direction of the lab. And this is how we became really interested in the question of sound to meaning. And very recently, I co-authored a paper with her about not vocal learning, but the neuroethology of vocal communication. That is a good summary of not only the recent work in my lab, but mostly the work in other people's lab that have looked at that. And so that's how kind of my lab became, you know, from a STIRF lab, so the STIRF is the spectral-temporeceptive field, to a sound to meaning lab. Okay, that was the historical background. I figured I'd pause here just so that you guys I get a breather and you get a breather too, and you can like maybe ask a question if you want here. I can take a look and see if there's any chat too. Okay. So even if there's no question, we'll
Frederic,
yeah.
Can you did that beautiful baby speech. Can you do that again for us? That was really pretty good, right in the beginning. That was just great.
I should have taped myself when I was talking to my kids, right?
That was very nice.
Okay, let me keep on going here. So as you can see, I spent a lot of time just talking a little bit about this history, and so I'm going to kind of stay at a very high level in terms of the work that we've done. I have a lot of slides, and during the the question and answer, I can go a little bit deeper into the questions. But if I say something that is just doesn't make any sense, please interrupt me. So the first thing I want to do is to kind of introduce you to this repertoire of the zebra finch, and show you both all the call types that they're producing and the fact that they have this individual signature. And you'll see that these are some of the two things that we're currently exploring. So one of the things that Julie did is get a very large database of call types of calls that zebra finches produce. And we've kind of divided this into the calls that are produced by juveniles, the calls that are affiliative, and the calls that are agonistic. So the juveniles produce a begging call, which is really, the feed me call. And then as they develop this begging call, or some of the begging calls, change into what's called a long tonal call, which is going to be their distance call, which is really more like, hey, I'm here, where are you? And so we can listen to these. So first you heard the begging calls, and then the long tonal calls. Then there's a set of affiliative calls, and these are quite elaborate. They tend to be mostly soft calls, except for the distance calls. And they're used for pair bonding as well as for group bonding. So zebra finches are gregarious. They live in groups between 20 and about 80 birds in Australia. They get together to build nests. And so the whine is one of these calls that they produce before they're going to build the nest. So it's part of the courtship. They also produce a copulation whine. So it's a whine that they produce during copulation. Nest calls are calls that they produce again around the nest and as they're pair bonding. The tet is a contact call that is not directed necessarily to your mates, but to all the birds of the group. And then they have a distance call, which is a loud version of the contact call. I'm playing this quickly just for the sake of time. The zebra finch male sings. For a lot of birds, the song is a mark of the territory, but it's also for sexual attraction, a display. And so that's the case for the zebra finch. So here's the song of the zebra finch. That's basically the male showing off. And then we have these agonistic calls. So they have the whisk call, which is an aggressive call, a distress call. And the zebra finch has two alarm calls, the thuck and the tuck. They're interesting because they're very similar acoustically, but different enough that when the bird produces the thuck, the chicks will quiet down. So it's an alarm call that is directed from parents to the chicks to tell them to be quiet because there's a danger, whereas a tuck is a kind of a higher alarm that is directed at everybody and that gets all the birds to quiet down. So that's that. So that gives you an idea of the range of sounds that are produced that have different meanings in zebra finches. The next thing is that birds have an individual signature. So this will be akin to the voice in humans. And this varies from the degree of the strength of the signature varies from call to call. And so what you hear first is the distance call, which is a call that is produced to stay in contact when birds are out of visual contact. And so you'll hear 3 renditions from bird 1 and then 3 renditions from bird 2. And you should see that these were recorded, by the way, in different days, but you'll hear that there's strong similarities between them. So clearly there's stereotypity. So they're, when they do their distance call, it sounds like the one they just did before, and there's some strong individual differences. Whereas if you do this with an aggressive call, you'll see that there's less of that. So those are again 3 aggressive calls from bird 1, followed by 3 aggressive calls from bird 2. Okay, so that's it. So there's individual signature, and different call types. So what are the kind of questions that we've been asking? And I think these are the same ones that, you know, people in kind of all communication, I would say, might be asking is what, who, and where, right? So what is the message? You know, what is being said? Who said it? And where does it come from, right? So we did a fair amount of work on where, but we're not working on that anymore. So I'm not going to talk about that, but we are focusing on the what and the who questions. And so we're using different methods. And with different methods, we can ask different questions. So we just analyze the sounds, for example, and just, you know, by just analyzing where is the information in the sound, able to ask, you know, what are the acoustic features that distinguish the different call types? And so if you think about human language, right, you can say, well, you know, where is the information in the phonemes? And you look at, you know, the different formants and the voice onset type and so forth. So you're looking for physical parameters that you know, that carry the meaning. So that's what we'll be doing with call types. Similarly for the individual signature. So once we know kind of, you know, what are the acoustical features, we can ask, well, where do these come from? Is this something that's coming from the vocal organ? So is it something that is related to the pitch? So which the pitch of the sound is something that you produce from the source, from your larynx, the bird from the syrinx, or is it something that comes from your upper vocal tract, something that is where you're filtering the sound? So we're thinking about those questions, and we can also think, you know, is this something that is passive? Is it just something that has to do with the morphology of the bird, and so it's always doing the same filtering, or does it require some kind of active shaping? Then we can do behavior, of course. We can see that, you know, are they really able to do this categorization of call types like we do? Are they able to recognize the vocalizers? What are their auditory memories? What is their memory capacity? And then we can look at the neural mechanisms. And so, oops, yeah, I was just zooming in onto those things. And so that's how I've organized a little bit, kind of the rest of the talk, and keep track of time. So I have 10 minutes. So I have these little bubbles here that show you kind of the methods that we use in the lab, and then these two big questions, which are the what and the who. And I'm going to go very quickly through the methods. Again, we can go back and I can tell you more about these. So we use bioacoustical analysis. This is just taking the sound, extracting features from the sound, and then performing statistics. And you could call the statistics machine learning if you want, but it's basically what we're doing to answer things like, well, where's the information, right? And so, yeah, and I think this is, you know, what we've been expanding this to it's really adapted to zebra finches, but we've been using it on more and more things, including baby cries, woodpecker drummings, and other things as well. So the other thing that we do is behavior. So I wish I had, you know, more time to go in the field and do kind of natural observations and natural behaviors. But in the lab, what we do is operant conditioning. And so this looks something like this. You can see here a zebra finch in an operant box. There's these buttons here, which are pecking keys. And what the bird can do is either peck or not peck to get a reward. And so there's little reward that happens here. Zebra finches are really good at learning these tasks. I'm just blown away by how easy it is in some ways to train them to do fairly sophisticated auditory tasks. The way it works is that they peck. When they peck, they hear a sound. If it's a sound that is grouped as a rewarded sound, they have to wait for 6 seconds. They have to refrain from pecking. The birds are a little hyper. They like to peck. So this is in some ways, you know, they have to like put a break on their pecking behavior and say, wait a minute, this if I don't peck, I'm gonna get some food. And so they refrain from pecking and then they get a reward. If it's a sound that's not rewarded, they want to peck because they want to say, oh, this is the wrong one. It's like you pushing on the, you know, you're not getting your right TV program and you're just going to next channel until you get the channel that you want. the bird learns to do this. So they peck, 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 peck until they get a rewarded sound. We can obviously then quantify how many of these sounds they interrupt, right? So they should interrupt the ones that are not rewarded and refrain from interrupting the ones that are rewarded. And so we can quantify this and see how well they're able to categorize sounds into rewarded versus non-rewarded. And so I think there's a little video here of this. So the bird is pecking here because it's non-rewarded, and then that's a rewarded vocalizer, and then it's going to get some food. Feeder goes up, and it goes and feeds. So that's the way that these work. It's quite simple, but it works very well. Then we do some neurophysiology. So we're recording with electrode arrays, and we did a lot of work in anesthetized birds, but we're moving to do this in fairly awake flying birds, where wireless recordings that they're carrying on their back. And so I just want to show you what that looks like. So you have a male and a female zebra finch here. They're both implanted. So the thing that they see on the head is this electrode array that goes into their auditory system. Female is on the left. She doesn't have a backpack, so she's not hooked, but the male is actually hooked to a little backpack that you can see has a chip where we can store the information. So as they're communicating, we can record from them, and we're just starting to get data where we have both the male and the female talking to each other while they're chatting like this. You hear they're making little sounds all the time. Okay, so that's the ephys. Yeah, Jack mentioned that I'm a computational neuroethology. This is kind of my, the goal is to do this right? And to be inspired by people who have thought about how to do this right. And so I think I'm trying to merge the approach of David Marr and Nico Timbergen to do this. So the computational neuroscience, I think David Marr had laid out a very clear plan on how to do this. And I'm not going to go into the details, but just I'm happy to talk to you about both David Marr and Nico Timbergen and how merging these two is something that is a good aspiration to have. All right, I have about 5 minutes left. Let's see. Right. Well, let's see how far I get. Okay, so let's talk about the what. We did a lot of these bioacoustical analysis on the what, and one of the things that we found that I think is cool is that a lot of people in the birdsong field were kind of obsessed by the syrinx, the vocal organ of the bird, and for good reason. The syrinx is really amazing in birds. It's this, their vocal organ is where the trachea divides into the bronchi. And they actually have two vocal organs, right? So it's as if we had two larynx, and they can actually sing with two voices. And each one of these is innervated in songbirds with 6 different muscles with very fine control, very fast muscle fibers, and they're able to do amazing things with their vocal organ. So, a lot of the focus has been on the control of the syrinx, right? How do we control the syrinx to create meaning? What we found, and that was surprising to us, is that the call types actually have phonements. So just like human vowels, right, where we use our upper vocal tract to kind of shape that filter, birds do the same thing, and that these phonements actually carry a lot of the information, and so that's kind of one of the main results. And I have this cool video of the upper vocal tract of the birds, because again I want to show you these guys because I think it's a little bit again underknown this amazing vocal control that they have of their upper vocal tract, and so we can watch this. So that's a cardinal producing the syllable, but they're able to kind of control their oropharyngeal cavity, which is basically their throat, in very sophisticated ways, including, you know, opening and closing their beak. And so and we found that this is one of the ways that they're able to kind of, you know, generate these calls with all this different information. Let me skip this just for the sake of time, because I'm going to talk more about this for the who question. And let's just show you a little bit of the results from the neurobiology of this. So we've been recording in the auditory area. So this is the auditory system of songbirds. The information comes from the auditory thalamus into these areas here that is analogous to auditory cortex. This L1, L2, L3 is like primary auditory areas. And we've been putting a lot of electrode arrays into these areas. This is kind of a Nissl stain that shows you the damage, you know, after the fact. So these are electrodes coming down in the brain and recording from all these areas right here, which is where we find the auditory cortex. And what we find is units like this one. So I show you an example here of a unit that is very selective to particular call types. And so on the top here is, you know, the different call types that we played back. So nest calls, tets, thucks, the aggressive whisk call, the distance call, and so forth. And you can see that this neuron responds to the aggressive calls, maybe a little bit to the distress calls, but really not to all the other calls. So it has this kind of selectivity for aggressive calls. We can show that like this. So what we can do is we can, you know, we want to put on the x-axis the stimulus, on the y-axis the response. And so this is what we do. We take the different different calls that they produce, and we project it onto a feature which tells us how aggressive this call is, okay, without going into the details. So this is an axis that corresponds to the sound, to the stimulus, where you go from, oh, less aggressive to more aggressive-like call. Each one of these bars is one stimulus that we played, color-coded by what type of call type it is. And you can see that all the reds are over here, right? I mean, they should be, because, you know, they're more aggressive, but they're also elicit higher firing rates. And we get this kind of, you know, categorical responses to call types. We've quantified categorical responses in a much more rigorous way than this, but I think this is a good kind of graphical way of explaining this. But we can do the same thing using kind of information theoretic measures to do this. The thing that's a little bit disappointing maybe is that we don't really find an area in the auditory cortex where we find categorical cells. So this is the plot you should look at. This is a slice of the auditory cortex of the bird. It's more primary in the central areas and more secondary as you go either deeper or more dorsal. And there's a little bit of anatomy here, functional anatomy, but not very much. There's quite a bit of mixing as well. Okay. That's some of the results. I'm going to skip some of the computations that we're doing to understand what's going on with categorical neurons, and just tell you more about, in the last few minutes, about the who question, the individual recognition. What we found is, surprisingly, that in all these call types, including that aggressive calls, there's some degree of individual information. So there's individual signature in all of them, but there's no voice, okay? So it doesn't generalize. So if you learn that, you know, Bob is Bob and Ted is Ted from their distance call, you're gonna have to learn it again when they're becoming aggressive for their aggressive call, right? So you're not able to generalize the individual information that you get from one call type to the other. So the way that they're doing their individual signature is really by, you know, having their own way of saying, watch out, and their own way of saying hello, right? So one bird would say hello, the other one would say hi. and then, you know, watch out and be careful or something like that, right? They're individualized, kind of each one of their call types, but they don't have a voice. Okay, so that was somewhat surprising, at least to me. Okay, the other thing is that, so that's the acoustics. The birds are amazingly good at doing this. This kind of, it's work that we've done recently, and I want to share with you because it is amazing. They're able to memorize the individual signature of up to 50 different birds simultaneously, okay? And the way we do this is with this operant conditioning, where we ask them to recognize on day one vocalizer versus the other one. And just focus on these lines here, right? So they just have, it's not one stillness versus another one. It's a little bit, it's a hard task already. They're basically getting multiple renditions of one vocalizer, all right, based on distance call, for example, and then multiple renditions of another vocalizer, and they're able to separate, you know, Bob from Ted, right? And the way they do this is, you know, one of them is not rewarded, this guy, and so they have to interrupt it. And you can see that the probability of interruption of pecking, right, starts at 0.5, and then they interrupt more and more this one, and less this one. These two lines separate, showing that they're learning. Then we add 3 more vocalizers in each group. So they're doing a 4v4. So they're discriminating 8 vocalizers. And you see, as you add the new ones, they start at 0.5. And as they're learning, oh, now this one right here, they're able to distinguish it. So they start to interrupt it, and then they distinguish this one, and then this one. By the end of the day here, they got the 4x4 task. And then we asked them to do an 8x8 task. And again, these new guys that show up here, which at first are a chance, they have to be them, they start to be able to recognize them. And we make the task harder and harder when they're able to discriminate between more and more vocalizers. They do this, I'm just going to skip this because I'm sure you guys are saturating, and you can probably just hear what I'm saying. It might be better. So they're able to kind of make these memories. I've shown you 8v8, but we've gone all the way to, you know, 50, so 25v25. They're able to separate all these vocalizers. They only need like 10 renditions, 10 examples or less to be able to do this task. So this is a very fast memory. And if we test them a month later, we can show that they've retained this memory as well. Just amazing abilities to do these auditory memories for objects, not for sounds, but for groups of sounds, right? These are like renditions from one vocalizers. So we just got this accepted in Science Advances, and it should be coming out soon, but it's a very impressive thing that the birds do. Enough, you know. Okay, and we've started to do some neurophysiology to look for these memories. I'm just gonna stop there. So let me just kind of conclude and bring up some discussion items. So Marler, 2004, like, you know, he, as I said, you know, rang the alarm bell saying that, you know, bird calls are the neglected orphans of avian behavioral neurobiology, and you know, since Julie came in the lab and you know, got us excited about this, we've been working hard to kind of fix that. And we found, I think, a lot of things, and now we're not the only lab who's doing this, that is, you know, showing some cool results in vocal combination in songbirds, and I think making the link with humans and human language and human speech a lot stronger. And so this is the point that I've made, the song imitation behavior. And this is why I like song imitation or vocal imitation better than vocal learning, is impressive, is unique in songbirds. I think is unique, and, you know, it's much greater than anything else that's seen in the animal kingdom. But that's different than learned categories of sounds, right? Which is something that we need to do when we learn language. And by the way, birds also are able to do this, right? They're able to make these categories of sounds that have specific meanings, as we just shown with the identity. So source versus filter, this is just the fact that both of these are engaged. And I think there was this misunderstanding that in birds it was all the source and in humans it was all the filter, to make it kind of simplistic. And I think that the balance is a lot more even. So both use both, and in some ways having this ability to have a flexible filter in birds is just as important in terms of communication. Memory capacity, this is the work that we've just shown. This is very similar to the fast mapping that humans have when they learn language. Basic syntax, I haven't said anything about basic syntax, but because zebra finches don't really do this, but other birds put call types together. So the Japanese tit will have an approach signal combined with an alarm signal. That means come over, but be careful. So they're able to kind of do very simple syntax. There's some nice papers on birds having internal representations. I think somebody mentioned about corvids, and if you, I don't have my version of Science here, but the latest version of Science has a nice study from the Needler group showing that crows have basically internal representations of sensory stimuli, and this has also been shown in birds with alarm calls. So that once you prime a bird with an alarm call for a snake versus a raptor, they'll have different behaviors when you present them with stimuli that might look like a snake versus a raptor. And then the last thing is that birds use sounds for communication in all different ways. And this is a study that I did in collaboration with a French researcher on woodpeckers. And woodpeckers are interesting because they have a full repertoire of sounds that they produce for communication, but they also, as you guys know, make sounds when they forage, right? When they're pecking on trees and make sounds. Well, they took that sound, right? That the ability to kind of peck to make sounds to start to communicate. And so this is called the woodpecker drumming. So birds are just amazing at using sounds to communicate, and their brain is both through evolution and development wired to do this. And so I think it's really cool. Okay, so I just want to kind of thank everybody who worked on this. So you have the kind of the list of all the people in my lab. I think there's a trend that some of my early students and postdocs went into academic careers, and more recently Google and Intel, you can see, has taken some of my PhD students. No comments, not for good or for bad. It's just kind of more of a observation of that. I have a current group of people who is just awesome. And my UCB colleagues. I think this is kind of interesting because you might think, how does Frederic fit in a psychology department, right? I don't know where I would fit elsewhere. So I'm really happy you guys decided to hire me. And you could see that this is the people I've collaborated. So in parentheses is the number of publications that we have together. So I've collaborated with many of you guys, and I really appreciate being part of this group. And I also have collaborators in France and in Germany. I think I better stop.
Well, thanks for that wonderful talk, Frederic. We can just open it up to questions, and people can just turn their mic on and ask questions if they're interested. Well, I'll get the pump primed here. I'm kind of curious about this finding, the most recent finding you had on memory of individual bird, essentially identity, I would have not expected that. That seems like a really large number. And how do you think that number is going to vary across bird species? I mean, birds vary hugely in how smart we think they are. So,
Yeah,
are
I think it is going to vary. It is ethologically kind of relevant for zebra finches because they live in these, they're very gregarious. They live in these groups of, as I say, 20 to 80 individuals. It's kind of interesting. I don't think there's very much known about whether they really need to know the identity of all these individuals. So so my guess is that it is going to vary among birds, that zebra finches might be actually very good at doing individual recognition. Their song is very idiosyncratic. Their distance call is very idiosyncratic, meaning that every individual has one that sounds quite different from another bird. So also that makes the task a little easier, but not that easy. We're not able, people in my lab cannot do this, we don't speak birdsong, but we have a really hard time, be able to do these kind of classification tasks. So, so I think we'll definitely see some variations.
Are there field studies of the uses that the birds make of these ability to identify individuals?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of their mate, there's a lot of nice studies. So they do mate recognition based on their calls, and there's all the sophisticated behavior that happens around the nest, where both partners, when they have the chicks, the partners will go forage one at a time, and before they come back to the nest, they'll produce a call. Usually the distance call, and they'll only get a reply if it's the mate. So there's clear mate recognition that is very important. Those reasons for in that case. So yeah, there's both studies in the lab and in the field for individual recognition. Yeah.
Nice.
Frederic, are there other senses that are used in combination with audition or auditory sensation to identify different birds, and also for alerting? I know they don't have facial expressions, but smell, visual recognition. Are they involved in any way within this process?
Yeah, I think it's thought that the birds are not very good at olfaction, but it doesn't mean that they're terrible at it either. They're just not as good as mammals, for sure. Well, depending on songbirds. There's some birds are very good at olfaction, but songbirds are not very good at olfactory cues. But visual cues for sure. Yeah, visual cues, and as well as body language. So yeah. There's songbirds that do tap dancing. I don't know how much information there is in the individual tap dance of the birds. I don't think that has been seen, but there's definitely visual cues as well, for sure. And in fact, the zebrafinch, they use a different call when they have visual contact versus not, right? So they do have an approach call that has individual signature, the TET call, that they use all the time when they're in groups, but they see each other at the same time, and they're still producing this low, contact call. But then when they don't see each other, they produce a different contact call. So,
and just less quickly, are there confusion studies where you sort of mix and match the identifying information to discover the priorities and primacies that they use in different situations?
Like visual modality versus auditory modality, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I don't think people have done that. Not for individual recognition. I might be wrong though. I mean, people have done sophisticated things where video screens where they, there might be some studies like that. I can't quite put, they've done things like that for whether a female would find a song attractive based, just on the song, or the song plus the visual information. So there's plenty of studies like that, but I don't think there's studies in terms of individual recognition that try to separate the modalities.
Frederic, there is actually a study that zebra finches females can discriminate their eggs by smell. And it's only just before hatching. I don't know if it's, to fight because of nest parasitism. And there's more and more songbird work in olfaction, looking, birds detecting a nest has a predator odor, or birds actually using odor for mate choice too. So should not discount olfaction in songbirds yet.
Thank you, Lucia. I'm not discounting anything, but thank you for.
Yeah, I know, no, and that was incredible talk. It's this new study, the discrimination is just unbelievable. So.
Yeah, it's amazing. I agree. Yeah.
Frederic, the discriminate, is it different on recognizing other birds' languages for the fear calls or the danger calls as opposed to the more positive? That is, with a group of 50, if any one of them yells, "Look out," do they respond?
That's a good question, right? So the alarm call is fairly individualized in zebra finches. So they will have information about during alarm calls who's sounding the alarm. So it might be something that is useful information. If it's your partner or somebody from your group that's sounding the alarm, it's probably more important than if it's somebody else. So,
could be they just don't want to listen to birds that cry wolf.
Yeah. Do you guys know about the drogo bird? You read this in Science. So the drogo is an African bird that is imitating the alarm calls of meerkats, right? And so what's amazing about this is that they do this for deceit purposes, right? So they imitate the alarm of meerkats, so the meerkats run away, and then they get to eat food that the meerkat is eating, which is the little worms. But they're really smart at doing this because to make sure that the meerkats, because they're not stupid either, right, believe them, they actually do the alarm call in the correct context for many times until they gain the confidence of the meerkats. And once the meerkats are confident that they can rely on the alarm call of the drogo, they then produce it to steal the food, which is really quite amazing. So
Frederic, do you know anything about if there's life history relationships to the bird call? I mean, it's interesting because of course birds are putting in more parental investment a lot of the time than mammals are. And are there relationships between things like how much pair bonding or how much parental investment there is and what kinds of learning they're doing?
That's a good question. So they're learning. Obviously, the song is something that is learned, and some of the studies there have been comparing zebra finches to Bengalese finches in kind of cross fostering, with the zebra finches having they're a lot more in your face with their chicks than the Bengalese finches, so they interact a lot more during the singing, and shown some effects of that. I think it was a little bit hard to disentangle. It's interesting. Yeah, so there's a little bit of studies. I can't quite synthesize something. I know there's interesting things with parasitic birds too, right? Because they have to they grow up in the wrong nest, and then they have to learn to sing the song. So yeah.
Frederic, I wanted to ask about other species too, in terms of comparative work. of colonial species that can be living with thousands of other individuals, I think, versus more territorial species that might just encounter their neighbors. And has there been any comparative mapping of the auditory regions? So much has been done in zebra finches, but maybe by adding species.
Right. So to do like more territorial species that kind of live alone and see whether there are differences.
The area L and yeah. I mean, are these areas really similar? Even just white crowns to zebra finches. The extra storage seems like it could be immense with parrots, for example. And
right. There's not enough comparative work for sure. Especially in terms of the neurobiology. So I just got canaries.
Yeah.
They're so beautiful. I don't know I don't want to put electrodes in their heads. I'm just staring at them and listening to them sing for the moment, but we have some plans for them too. So.
That's what happened with Notenbaum and parrots. He got them to study them and then just couldn't do it.
Yeah. Frederic, this is really cool work. I had a couple of questions because it's just so thought-provoking. But so the first was, and I think other people have touched on this, but to what extent these birds can actually use the information about the individual to maybe modulate kind of their meaning inferences from the calls. So for instance, if there's a bird who cries wolf or something like that, are they going to respond less to that alarm call based on that particular individual? And I guess related to that, is there a sense in which birds can actually learn about kind of other birds around them on the basis of calculating statistics, for instance, on who are the other birds who are frequently putting out aggressive calls, and then to actually learn to be somewhat wary of those birds or something like that. I imagine a lot of this would have to involve kind of field studies. And then the other set of questions I was thinking about have to do with how this system of calls might change over time. And I'm just wondering, like, whether there's, is there any evidence that new kinds of calls arise over time, or the calls end up being used for new purposes over time, perhaps in response to kind of environmental changes or pressures? Sorry, I know that was a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot of questions. So for the last question, there's just like in primates, there's a lot of work on alarm calls, because alarm calls, they're both kind of innate, and they get kind of, the animals learn basically their meaning through experience, right? And so, and birds, just like primates, will have different alarm calls for different predators, or even for predators that are having different behaviors, which is kind of interesting. And so, and this is something that the birds have to learn. Whether then this evolves through cultural, I'm not sure that I'm not sure if people have gone that far. There is, I don't know if you know the deer enemy effect. This is so in territorial birds, birds learn their neighbors, right? And so their neighbors, when there's an intrusion right at their boundary of the territory, if it's from one of the neighbors, they know to ignore it because it's the neighbor. But then if they hear a song from the same species, but that they never heard before, then they'll have a very strong reaction, right? And that behavior is been studied quite a bit, and it is also quite interesting because just like Peter Murray said, there's dialects, right? If a bird comes from the same region, it will have a more similar song. It's still different, but more similar. And those are going to be treated differently than if it's a bird that is coming from a completely different region. So, and birds have to learn all of this, right? All of this is something that is learned. Yeah.
Frederic, I had a question about, I think it's amazing how birds can hear a song and immediately kind of have the motor plan to generate or mimic whatever they hear. So is there a lot of research done on the motor learning of these birds, like how they start to mimic something and learn through errors, maybe by like producing the sound themselves and then achieving good performance over time?
Yeah, you know, like most of the work in birdsong field is about that. Unfortunately, it's all in the zebrafinch, or 99% of it is in the zebrafinch. And so the zebrafinch is, in terms of vocal learning, is not particularly a fast imitator. You know, it's going to take it, you know, thousands of trials over months, you know, thousands of songs per day over months to really kind of get to its final product. So this kind of fast, you know, auditory to motor mapping is something that birds do. You know, mockingbird, right? I mean, we have mockingbirds that are pretty amazing at doing that, and it's not been studied in terms of the neurobiology of it. So I think that's wide open. I think that's a great, yeah, I'm like fascinated by that, because that's a complicated transformation, right? And able to do it instantaneously is something that's very sophisticated. Yeah.
Irv, you're muted, so we can't hear you. I think you're trying to ask a question.
I'm sorry. It seems like to teach for the bird to learn to avoid danger, like a cat, I don't know what the reinforcer could be, because if it's a cat, he's probably not going to live to do it. So it would seem like it's got to be getting some messages from other birds that they're learning to reinforce the fear response. Or it's all hardwired, which seems unlikely from the way you described it.
Right. So I think part of it is hardwired, like alarm calls. You know,
they're hardwired.
They're partly hardwired, but then just like in primates, right? Just like the vervet monkey story, the association of the alarm calls with particular predators or predators doing particular things, that is learned through experience. And so, you know, they live together, right? So they see what other birds are doing, and they realize, oh, wait a minute, you know, when I hear this alarm call, you know, I don't go to the ground, right? I go up in the tree. I don't know if that answered your question, Irv.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I'll stop.
Okay, are there any other questions? I can't see anybody, so so you have to either raise your hand on the chat or ask. Well, that was a really great talk, Frederic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frederic.
It's
Thank
so
you.
cool to see all the awesome stuff that you've done. I know you've worked with a lot more organisms than, you know, probably anybody else in the department at this point, and it's really impressive. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for, you know, I know
Thanks,
that
Frederic.
these Zoom meetings are hard, these Zoom talks, so thank you.
It was great. Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.